Hey folks, I hope you're all well. Orabox here. We'll be going over 9.2 Demonology Warlock in today's video, so without any further delay, let's get into it. Starting with the Covenants then. Demonology has access to two Covenants for PvE setting, Necrolord and Nightfare, with Necrolord pulling ahead in pure single target situations and Nightfare pulling ahead any situation where there is cleave. So, having discussed those and the fact that they are interchangeable, where are our soulbinds? Well, as you can see on the screen, we use Plague Deviser Marilith or we use Dreamweaver being the better two options, and these are the paths that I use in particular, but you can see that the potency conduits are the same. We don't actually use Covenant potencies for the soulbinds. We actually use Born of Blood, which is the most consistent option that we have, where we have a chance of creating a demonic core proc from Hand of Gul'dan. We use Carnivorous Stalkers. This primarily gets a lot more value once you have the two set and you start gearing through the tier. This is because Carnivorous Stalkers causes our Dreadstalkers attacks to have a % chance to trigger another Death Bite, or Dread Bite, sorry. This then will feed into our talent options, which we'll discuss later in the video. And you also have Tyrant's Soul, which after your Demonic Tyrant expires, you gain a stack of Demonic Core, increasing the damage your demons deal by a % for 15 seconds. If you don't have the two set for gearing, you can use Fel Commando, which causes your Felguard to deal more damage and take less damage. And these are kind of the bread and butters. The situational gain or minor gain from the Covenant specific conduit don't quite tie up or are as much benefit as the spec specific ones. Demonology is quite good in that sense. So as you can see, the soulbinds are pretty much copy and paste. In terms of the finesse conduits and the endurance conduits, Demonic Momentum, which you can see that I use in my Dreamweaver setup. I use it in my Marilith setup as well, but that's just because I have two finesse conduits. Dreamweaver is much better for helping me replace or move from location to location in raid, because the Demonic Momentum will give you that extra movement speed after using your Demonic Circle teleport. Fel Celebrity, on the other hand, which is this lower right finesse conduit, reduces the cooldown of Fel Domination. Now, Fel Domination allows us to speed up the cast of our summon pet, and Fel Celerity reduces that cooldown from a 3-minute cooldown to about a minute and a half, which is always handy. Unfortunately, Shade of Terror and Kilrock's Cunning aren't very useful in any setting, purely because Kilrock's Cunning affects Eye of Kilrogg, which causes it to no longer stealth and can now place Demonic Circle, which is... you could theoretically use it to pre-place something, but again, it's not very useful. And Shade of Terror, Fear can withstand 100% more damage before breaking. You're almost never going to want that to be a situation where it's running into China, because if you are targeted with fearing something, like in the Anduin fight for instance, no one's going to be DPSing it anyway, because the intention is to keep that ad away from damage. So it won't break until it needs to be broken. As for endurance conduits, you've got Accrued Vitality, which affects Drain Life, causing it to heal for more of the amount drained. So baseline, it's 44% of the amount drained over 10 seconds. It's mildly okay in a Mythic Plus setting, kind of gives you a little bit more defensive. Utility out of Drain Life, but isn't all that great. You have Diabolic Bloodstone, which means that anyone that consumes your Health Stone causes you to gain 10% leech for 6 seconds. This is a good all-rounder defensive conduit. And you've also got Resolute Barrier, which basically reduces the cooldown on Unending Resolve every time you get smacked about a bit. Now, I am not using them in my current Soulbinds, and that is primarily due to item level. I am getting more value out of reducing my Unending Resolve in Mythic Plus settings, and taking damage to accrue health is also beneficial to me at the moment. But in a ideal setting, I would be running Healthstone Leech, and that would be that. And now we move on to the talents. So Demonology has access to a couple of particular talent builds, depending on whether or not you have 2-piece, 4-piece, tier set, single target, or AoE scenarios. Starting with the assumption that you have no tier gear at all, your single target build will be as follows: Demonic Strength in the first row, Demonic Calling in the second. Demonic Calling is your bread and butter. You will not be coming out of Demonic Calling anytime soon. Your tier, or your 30 row, Dark Pact. Generally speaking, you can take Burning Rush if you feel you are lacking in mobility, but remember, Night Fae is our main go-to Covenant for any form of cleave, which means 9 times out of 10 you will have access to something like Soul Shape. And Burning Rush is kind of mitigated slightly for that reason. The 35 row, you'll be looking at Summon Vile Fiend with no tier. The 40 row, generally you'll be looking at Mortal Coil. In Mythic Plus settings, you can use Dark Fury to reduce the cooldown, but again, having Mortal Coil as another pseudo interrupt and a self-heal as well can be beneficial. The 45 row, you'll be looking at Grimoire Felguard. And for the 50 row, you will be looking at Demonic Consumption. That is your single target cookie cutter build. And if you acquire your 2 set, it doesn't really change much, aside from the fact that in the 15 row, you will be able to choose Dreadlash over Demonic Strength in fights where there is some cleave, because your dogs will bite everything within an 8-yard range. Remember, your Demonology 2 set summons an extra Dreadstalker, so you get 3 dogs rather than 2. Once you acquire the 4 set, however, we start approaching the Dog Mythic Plus build, and that is you use Dreadlash, Demonic Calling, Dark Pact, Burning Rush. They stay the same, but rather than using Summon Vile Fiend, now you use From the Shadows, which means that means that we have less setup for our Tyrants, which makes our single target prep time a little bit easier. Also, we do start looking at moving away from Grimoire Felguard to potentially using Soul Conduit. Generally, for an easier playstyle, you could use Soul Conduit, because every Hand of Gul'dan has a chance to refresh shards, which just means imps, and more imps. But for pure single target settings, you will still use Felguard, because it feeds into your Tyrants, or every other Tyrant, rather well. Demonic Consumption remains the same. And for Mythic Plus, you will generally be running that dog build of Dreadlash, Demonic Calling, From the Shadows, Grimoire Felguard, and Demonic Consumption, unless it's a fortified week, at which point you might swap from Grimoire Felguard to Soul Conduit for more consistent AoE, whereas Grimoire Felguard is better for single target purposes, so tyrannical weeks like this week, for instance. Moving on to the Legendaries then. For raiding purposes, Necrolords and those focusing on pure single target will be using Bale Spider's Burning Core, as that paired with the Shard of Annihilation legendary, once double legendaries are unlocked, cause a huge amount of damage amplification to Demon Bolt, with Bale Spider's increasing Demon Bolt damage for casting Shadow Bolt, so it's a very easy buff to maintain, and then Shard of Annihilation further increasing the damage of Decimating Bolt, which means that that combination gives Demonology Warlocks a substantial increase to execute damage. So you'll see that more towards the end of fight, which means that for, say, progressing Mythic Holondrus, maybe Mythic Skolex, these pure single target fights where it can get very, very hectic towards the end of the fight, having that extra execute damage might come in very, very, very clutch. For Night Fae though, for the raiding, it will still be Wilfred's, and pairing that with our Decaying Soul Satchel. Decaying Soul Satchel doesn't provide too much benefit for single target, but it does fill its purpose when you start getting into the cleave situations, which is what Night Fae is good at. For Mythic Plus though, we do end up having a few additional options. We have the likes of Grim Inquisitor's Dread Calling, which means that every soul shard spent on Hand of Gul'dan increases the damage of your next Dread Stalkers by 4% per cast, and this stacks up to 30 times. This is huge when you start getting the Forset and you start moving into that Soul Conduit build where you move away from Grimoire and you are trying to have every single shard you spend on Hand of Gul'dan. Which means that when you come to summoning your Dreadstalkers, especially when you've got Dreadlash and Call of Shadows, it's going to have this huge AoE feedback loop and a kind of consistent AoE damage. You do also have other legendaries available to you, like Forces of Horn Nightmare, which means that your Hand of Gul'dan has a 15% chance to recast a second time on your target for free, which also increases the amount of imps that you have out going into implosions or tyrants. Another option, or the final option really that I'd discuss, is Implosive Potential. Now, Implosive Potential means that your implosion grants 1% haste for 12 seconds for each imp exploded, and when this damages at least 3 targets, you gain 5% haste per imp rather than 1. This means that in AoE settings, you can have a substantial amount of haste going into a fight. And the best point to utilize Implosive Potential is if you can ever pull packs onto a boss. So you end up with a single target funnel, or a priority target to funnel, where you can maximize the usage of this haste from Implosion. And if you can extend it further by pulling more packs in. So Halls of Atonement, second boss, for instance, is a good example of this. If you can get all the adds that are summoned clumped in and then implode, you can refresh this and keep a high amount of haste going through the fight, which in turn will then feed into other things. And remember, you can get out a lot of imps, summon your tyrant, then implode them anyway, so you have the haste amp. So, legendaries. Now let's move on to the gear. Moving into gear then, whether it be raiding or through Mythic Plus, Warlocks have a pretty generic gearing list. From a raiding perspective, a lot of our gear comes from the final 3 of the raid. This is because it has a higher item level, and also the gear loot distribution seems to favour us having that higher item level. So for instance, the main hand offhand combination from Ragolon and the Jailer is naturally going to be higher. So if you're pushing high end heroic, or once you start getting into the mythic stages, be prepared to farm those bosses a lot. Going into dungeons, however, we have a healthy spread. The gearing list from Mythic Plus hasn't really changed at all through the expansion, with the likes of Mists of Tyr Scythe and Plaguefall being good keys for us. Plaguefall is also very, very good for us in terms of the trinket it drops, because of the way it interacts with Demonology and the fact that it increases our pet count, which feeds into our Tyrant health. So do remember that. The trinket from Plaguefall for us is huge. You will see that the gearing lists on screen have omitted the trinkets, and this is because although the trinkets are good, and there are options for your trinkets like Soul Letting Ruby. There's also options for IQD and things like that. Trinkets are very subjective and how you utilize them. There will be the cookie cutter best, which would be the trinket from Plaguefall, as I previously mentioned, because that adds to your pet, and Soul Letting Ruby. Those would be two very, very good, just generic all-round trinkets. But you then also have other trinkets like the First Sigil and the Scars of Fraternal Strife, which both drop from the Sepulchre of the first ones, and both of those trinkets are particularly good. However, the problem is with those trinkets, like the Sigil of the first ones for instance, although it has a huge amount of versatility to it, it is a 5-minute cooldown trinket. You also have the likes of IQD, or Inscrutable Quantum Device, which is a 3-minute cooldown and therefore doesn't line up well with our tyrants, but is a huge amount of damage increase. So trinkets give you a little bit of leeway, depending on how you play. Like if you have an IQD for instance, it's a 3-minute cooldown. And what you could do in a setting is you could maybe play with Grim Inquisitors, Legendary, rather than Wilfrids, therefore reducing your Tyrant usage from every 60 seconds-ish to every 90 seconds, and then every other Tyrant will line up well with IQD. Alternatively, you can aim to have every third Tyrant line up with IQD. Depending on how you want your spec to play, and whether you want like huge burst profiles versus if you want kind of big burst, mini burst, big burst, mini burst type scenarios. For those of you that have seen my Paladin content, you'll know what I mean when I talk about that. So trinkets are a little bit more forgiving, but again, it does boil down to how you play. There will be the cookie cutter best, and those are Soul Letting Ruby and Infinitely Divisible Ooze. Because as I said, those Pestules that fight by your side do actually class as pets for the sake of our demonic consumptions. Now we've talked about gear legendaries, let's go into the rotation. The rotation, as you can see on the screen, assumes that you do not have your force set yet, in that you are still using Vile Fiend, and as a result you're also going to need to spend time casting an extra Shadow Bolt in your opener. Once you have the force set, however, you can drop Summon Vile Fiend and the first Shadow Bolt, so that your rotation will be a pre-casted Demon Bolt into a Grimmar Felguard, Shadow Bolt, Dogs, a 3-shard Hand of Gul'dan spam. Your last Hand of Gul'dan can be sub 3 shards, but you need to make sure that you're extending both Dreadstalkers and Grimmar Felguard when you go into casting your Tyrant. Now, Soul Rot's location here depends very much on your conduit Soulbind that you're using. If you are using Naya, you are actually going to want to use it pre-Grimoire Felguard after your Demon Bolt cast, but I assume that you guys will also be playing Dreamweaver, so you will use it after your Tyrant cast. If you're playing Necrolord, you'll be using it up here, above Grimoire Felguard. But because of Dreamweaver's trait of when you use Soul Rot, you get haste amplification, we want that haste amp to affect our Tyrant and our Imps. Hence Soul Rot being so late in the rotation. But anyway, after Soul Rot, you Hand of Gul'dan, Shadow Bolt, Hand of Gul'dan, and then you crack on to the usual rotation where you are using Dreadstalkers on cooldown, you're using Tyrant on cooldown, you're maintaining your Hand of Gul'dans at 3 shards, and you're essentially building up using your Demonic Core procs. So you'll probably, if you have, say, 3 Demonic Core procs, you'll build up to, say, 4 shards, you'll Hand of Gul'dan into a Demon Bolt, Hand of Gul'dan, Demon Bolt, and you'll kind of go into this cycle motion where you're trying to make it so that every second or third spell you're lining up is going to be your Hand of Gul'dan. At that point, you have a legion of imps. So during the fight, you may get to the point where you're lucky and have a 20 imp tyrant, as well as having your Dreadstalkers and your Grimoire Felguard. Your opener, though, you're looking at more often than not having 6 imps for your first tyrant. If under the effects of lust, however, you may be lucky and have 9 out. Now, finally, we will briefly touch on Implosion, because there's a bit of controversy on how to use this ability for when it comes to AoE and Mythic Plus. Generally, unless you have Demonic Core procs, you are going to want to implode on around 6 imps. So as you can see here, I've typed up how your rotation will look leading into Mythic Plus imp usage. So if you have 2 or more stacks of Demonic Core, you're going to build up to 5 shards, cast Hand of Gul'dan, build to 4 using a Demon Bolt, Hand of Gul'dan, build to 3 using a Demon Bolt, Hand of Gul'dan, cast any spell you like at this point. It could be Dogs, if it's about to come off cooldown, or a Shadow Bolt. Ideally, it would be something like Dreadstalkers, because you're going to want them to apply the Talon from the Shadows, where it increases the Shadow Flame damage they do, and then you're going to cast Implosion with 9 imps. If you only have 1 or 0 stacks of Demonic Core, then it's build up to 5 shards, cast Hand of Gul'dan, build to 3, cast Hand of Gul'dan, and then again you're letting any spell to allow your final set of Wild Imps to spawn before throwing them into the pack. This blueprint essentially will help you have consistent cluster AoE damage, or cleave damage, as you go through dungeons in Mythic Plus. This is also handy to know when it comes to Explosive Week coming back around again, because Blizzard have fixed the bug where explosive orbs will actually take damage from being the direct target of implosions. Remember as well, the unique thing about Implosion is the fact that the damage, or the damage to the target that you have selected for Implosion, is based off the energy that the imps have remaining, whereas all the other adds around, or the other targets around your designated priority target, will actually take full damage. So come Explosive Week again, this means that we actually have targets that we can do considerable AoE off the back of while taking them down. So it'll help our group there. But it also means that if you do actually have a priority target or targets that you need to destroy in a pack, it's actually better to target off them. So my general tactic is I will implode the ad with the lowest health, because it actually does considerably more damage to everyone else around it. And that's just kind of my tip and trick when it comes to Implosion. Hopefully you guys have enjoyed the video, and I will catch you all in the next one. Take it easy and take care.